first of all, Austin, thank you very much for joining us in this edition of the Fulcrum Round Table. Austin, in your column, Why the GOP Needs to Help Prevent President Trump from Interfering in the November Election, you argue that the Republican leaders should stand up to Trump and actively prevent interference in the 2026 elections. What specific actions beyond public statements do you believe are both realistic and effective for GOP lawmakers to take right now?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation and thank you for the opportunity to talk about this subject. So I want to just fuss a little bit with the premise of beyond making statements. I think what the members of Congress could and should do, if they really wanted to prevent what looks like a series of actions designed to interfere with the 2026 elections, is first of all, tell that to the president that they don't want election interference. Short of that, they could oppose the legislation pending in the Senate right now, the so-called SAVE Act. Third, they could and should stop making public statements calling into question the integrity of the American electoral process. Republican Majority Leader in the Senate, John Thune, just yesterday talked about the need for the so-called SAVE Act, which would impose various restrictions on voting, by calling into question the integrity of American elections. So the power or the authority of the Republican Party, first of all, elections, as you know, are the responsibility of the states. The federal government has very little role. And so Republican legislators could and should say to the president, keep your hands off these elections. It's better that we lose than that we win with a shadow cast over the legitimacy of the results of the 2026 elections.
Your piece also highlights how presidential rhetoric can erode public trust in elections. How do you assess the long-term institutional risks if congressional leaders continue to echo claims of fraud without evidence?
I think the United States is in a period where the future of its constitutional democracy is very much at stake in ways that may not be immediately obvious. So critics of the president think that the president's actions in various ways threaten American democracy. The president has carried on a campaign to call into question the integrity of American elections almost since he's come on the scene. There is no evidence. I'm going to repeat that as my elocution teacher might have advised me to do. There's no evidence of significant electoral fraud or voting by non-citizens in American elections. So this has been part of the president's brand. Any election that he loses, he says must be rigged. Well, it's bad enough when the president does it. But when the leaders of the first branch of American government, the Congress, get on board with that message, they add fuel to a fire that is eroding the public confidence that our elections can be conducted in a way in which we can believe that the results are legitimate. So I think the damage is long-term. I teach at the college level. I teach people between 18 and 20, 21 years old. This is all they've grown up with. Talk about rigged elections, talk about fraud. It's one thing when it comes from a single figure. It's quite another thing when the whole political party, the whole Republican Party, embraces it. And what I believe is that leaders of Congress have a stake in the legitimacy and integrity of the branch of government which they serve. And if there is monkeying around with the election in 2026, it will further erode the already weakened legitimacy of the Congress of the United States in the eyes of the American people. Nostalgia is a trap, but I'm going to go into that trap for a minute. For a very, very long time, American elections were a model for the world. We have a system of a kind of nonpartisan election monitoring. We have a system in which the conduct of elections was traditionally thought to be a kind of engineering problem, not a partisan problem. And in the golden era, the United States would send monitors abroad to ensure the integrity of elections in other countries. So this attack on the integrity of American elections does great damage to something for which Americans were rightly proud for decades and decades. And that's part of the damage that is done by this effort to call into question the integrity or fairness of American elections.
In a similar op-ed to yours, Why Nationalizing Elections Threatens America's Federalist Design, Francis Johnson's column argues that nationalizing U.S. elections would undermine the constitutional design that intentionally dispenses power across the state, and that centralization, though often framed as a fix for inconsistency, creates new risks that outweigh its promised benefits. How do you reconcile the need for consistent national election standards with the author's argument that decentralization is essential to preventing concentrated power and single point vulnerabilities?
So up until this point, we've had a system highly weighted towards the role of the states in the conduct of elections. That's clear in the Constitution. The federal government's role has largely been to ensure that people's voting rights would be protected. So when the federal government acts to ensure that people's voting rights are protected, that seems to me to be a legitimate role for the federal government to play. We're a long way from the idea that your rights depended on what state that you lived in. Your civil rights depended upon whether or not you lived in Massachusetts or California or Louisiana or Mississippi. So a national role is not in of itself, in my view, incompatible with a system that respects the right of states to organize elections, so long as the national role is to promote and protect the right of all Americans to cast their ballots. That doesn't seem to me to be what is going on now. So I think national role in and of itself, it depends on what the federal government is using its powers to do. So I think there's more to look at the substance rather than the form of a national intervention.
Going back to your column, you draw historical parallels to post-Civil War Southern Democrats and warn that collaborating with anti-democratic behavior can stain a party for generations What indicators should the public watch for in this year's election that would signal whether the GOP is repeating that pattern or breaking from it?
Well, there's several things, and they are unfolding. So first is the demand of the federal government, backed by their allies in Congress, that states turn over their voting rolls. Why would states need to turn over their voting rolls? Well, the claim, of course, is that the federal government wants to ensure that non-citizens are not voting. And again, I want to go back to what I started with. This is a solution in search of a problem. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the president's claim that the Republicans should back a kind of nationalization of the election. He already started that process almost as soon as he got back into the White House, when he issued an executive order protecting election integrity. Third, look at the fate of the SAVE Act, which passed the House and is now being debated in the Senate. Fourth, be attentive to the threat that federal forces, whether ICE agents or others, will appear at voting booths, at voting stations in blue states. And lastly, be attentive to what happens on election night and in the days after. Are voting machines seized? Are voting records taken? And if so, what do congressional Republicans say or do? Nostalgia, as I said, is a trap. But there was a time when Republican members of Congress thought of themselves as wedded to the prerogatives of their branch more than their loyalty to their political party. We're a long way from that. But perhaps the threat of election interference by the Trump administration in the 2026 election will wake them from their slumber and give them the courage to defend the integrity of congressional elections.
We can only hope so. In another column, this one by Nick Allison, a party that seeks to nationalize and control elections has entered fascist territory. Nick writes describes that U.S. election centralization as a deliberate constitutional safeguard. He says states administer elections to prevent any single national authority from controlling who votes or how votes are counted. Now, we've spoken a lot about this in this conversation. What do you see as the most immediate democratic risk if a major party continues pursuing greater centralization, control over elections? So I know, again, this has been the theme of our conversation, but any final thoughts on that?
Hugo, what is good for the goose is good for the gander. I hope I get a prize for using the most cliches in one of your conversations. Once this thing is out of the bag, that the federal government is going to interfere with elections, it'll lie around like a loaded gun, waiting for the next political party or the next political leader to pick it up. Democracy demands a kind of faith in the wisdom of the people, faith that nobody's fate is going to be sealed or decided by a single election, faith that if you relinquish power to some group, when it's time to relinquish power comes, they will do what you have done. Faith in democracy and the faith that democracy requires are precious things. And the president seems not to be attentive to his role as a guardian of those precious things. So it's not just that the control of one or another political party of the Congress will be at stake on the ballot. What will be at stake on the ballot will be this faith that sustains democratic politics itself.
And we'll leave it at that. Faith. Austin, thank you so much again for your time and for your insights.
Thank you, and thank you for all the work that the Fulcrum does to keep the health of American democracy at the forefront of our attention.
Thank you very much.